Okay, let's just take a second to think about the human brain. It's wild, right? It literally generates enough electrical power to run a small light bulb, yet it's arguably the most complex, awe-inspiring structure in the known universe. I mean, this 3-pound mass of gray and white matter sitting right inside your skull is, for all intents and purposes, a biological computer. It regulates your breathing, lets you appreciate an amazing meal, empowers you to create art, and holds literally every memory you've ever had. Basically, your brain is you. But in this explainer, we're going to look at what happens when this perfectly balanced system gets fundamentally compromised and hijacked by an outside force.
Okay, let's dive into this. How does a simple chemical substance enter your body and just completely overwrite your most basic survival instincts? How does it push someone toward incredibly self-destructive behavior, totally overriding logic, self-preservation, and even love? To really understand addiction, we can't just brush it off as a bad habit. We have to look under the hood at the actual biology of what's going on.
So let's start with Section 1, the brain's operating system.
Right. Before we can really grasp the devastation of this chemical invasion, we need a baseline. We need to see what a normal, healthy brain looks like when it's just firing on all cylinders. Now, our biological computer doesn't run on silicon chips or copper wire. Instead, your brain consists of billions of individual cells called neurons. Picture them as microscopic switches organized into these vast, crazy, intricate networks. And these circuits coordinate literally everything you think, feel, and do. When one neuron gets enough signals from its neighbors, boom, it fires, passing the message down the line. It's this stunningly complex highway of information.
But here's where the biology gets absolutely fascinating. These neurons, they don't actually touch each other. There's a microscopic gap between them. And to send a message across that gap, your brain uses neurotransmitters. These are chemical messengers. They're basically the essential communication method of our brain's operating system, carrying instructions from one cell to the very next.
And this brilliantly illustrates the flawless, natural communication process between those cells. It happens in 4 elegant steps, all in mere milliseconds. First, the sending neuron releases the neurotransmitter. Second, it floats across that tiny gap, which, by the way, is called the synapse. Third, it attaches to a receptor on the receiving cell. It fits perfectly, literally like a key sliding into a lock, and that triggers the new signal. Finally, step 4, these special molecules called transporters scoop up the neurotransmitters and recycle them back into the first cell, cleanly shutting off the signal. It is a perfectly balanced, closed-loop system.
Which brings us to Section 2, the great chemical hijack. So now that we know how the system is supposed to work, what happens when a foreign substance, a drug, enters this delicate ecosystem? Well, things go off the rails rapidly, because drugs are essentially chemical imposters. They physically interfere with how your neurons send, receive, and process signals. Some drugs, like marijuana or heroin, actually have a chemical structure that mimics your natural neurotransmitters. They're basically picking the lock with a fake key, sending totally abnormal messages through the network. But other drugs, like amphetamines or cocaine, they take a different approach. They cause your neurons to release abnormally huge amounts of natural chemicals, or they completely block those transporter recyclers we just talked about. So instead of a clean, recycled signal, the whole system just gets completely flooded.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer scale of the disruption. Think of your brain's natural rewards. Eating a great slice of pizza, laughing with a friend, maybe listening to your favorite song. Those create small, healthy bursts of chemicals. It's kind of like someone gently whispering in your ear. But drug rewards? As you can imagine, it's like someone putting a massive megaphone directly to your ear and shouting at the absolute top of their lungs. It's this overwhelming, unnatural surge that completely drowns out the normal, healthy whispers of everyday life.
All right, let's move on to Section 3, wiring the reward circuit.
So let's zoom out from the cellular level to the actual regions of the brain. What specific hardware actually gets corrupted by all this chemical shouting? Well, there are 3 main regions fundamentally altered by drug use, and these areas dictate your core personality and survival traits. We're looking at the basal ganglia, the extended amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. Basically, the control centers for motivation, stress, and impulse control. Let's break down exactly what happens to each one.
First up, the basal ganglia. This is the core of your reward circuit, the part responsible for the pleasure you feel from healthy routines. Initially, drugs severely overactivate this circuit. That's what produces the massive euphoria, or the high. But remember, the brain is highly adaptable. With repeated chemical flooding, the circuit tries to protect itself by turning down its own sensitivity.
And the tragic consequence here is that it becomes physically hard or literally impossible to feel pleasure from anything else in life besides the drug. Next is the extended amygdala. This circuit manages stressful feelings. Now, while the basal ganglia loses sensitivity, this circuit actually becomes more sensitive with drug use. As that intense high fades, the extended amygdala triggers severe anxiety, irritability, just profound unease. This is what we call withdrawal, and it highlights a really heartbreaking reality of long-term addiction. Eventually, a person isn't even using drugs to get high anymore. They're just using them to get temporary relief from the overwhelming misery of their own altered brain chemistry.
Then we have the prefrontal cortex. This is the very front part of your brain that handles logic, planning, self-control. The chemical hijack shatters this region like a broken steering wheel, drastically reducing impulse control and driving a person to compulsively seek the drug. And what's absolutely crucial to understand here is that the prefrontal cortex is the very last part of the brain to fully mature. This is exactly why teenagers are so incredibly vulnerable. Introducing drugs during this developmental window, it can actually destroy the brain's capacity for self-control before it's even fully built.
Finally, we have to look at the ultimate physical consequence, and that involves the brainstem. So the brainstem controls automatic life-sustaining functions. Think your heart rate and your breathing. Certain drugs, particularly opioids, directly disrupt this area. This is the stark biological mechanism of a fatal overdose. The drug basically interferes with the brainstem so severely that it simply depresses your breathing until it stops entirely.
Moving on to Section 4, the vicious cycle. We've seen how the hardware gets damaged, but how does this translate into a long-term self-destructive loop? So the crucial point here is understanding the role of dopamine. For a long time, we used to think dopamine was just the pleasure chemical, but scientists now know it's really a reinforcement mechanism. When those massive, unnatural surges of dopamine hit, they essentially teach your brain that taking the drug is a critical survival priority. It tricks your biological computer into prioritizing the chemical over literally everything else. Food, relationships, career, your basic health. The brain genuinely believes it needs the drug to survive.
And because the brain is being repeatedly screamed at by these massive chemical surges, it tries to defend itself by physically reducing the number of receptors that can even receive those signals. This biological defense mechanism, that's what we call tolerance. To overcome this deafened system, the user is then forced to take larger, increasingly dangerous amounts of the drug just to reach the familiar high they used to get from a much smaller dose. And this perfectly highlights the tragic irony of drug abuse. You start with the rocket ship, the massive artificial euphoria and chemical surges, but chasing that launch leads directly to the dying rose, a biological reality where the person is left flat, lifeless, unmotivated, and deeply depressed. In the quest to feel incredibly good, the brain gets locked in a permanent state where it can't even feel normal. Let's move on and see how this builds, because this biological rewrite creates a challenge that can last a lifetime. There's a saying that really captures this perfectly. Like riding a bike, the brain remembers. Those huge dopamine surges wire incredibly deep connections between the drug and your external environment. Because of this learned reflex, a person who has been totally clean for a decade can walk through an old neighborhood and suddenly experience overwhelming, uncontrollable cravings triggered entirely by those environmental cues. The biological memory of that hijack runs incredibly deep. So we've explored the amazing complexity of the brain's operating system, and we've seen exactly how chemical imposters break the locks, flood the circuits, and rewire our very survival instincts towards self-destruction. Knowing how a drug fundamentally overwrites your biological hardware, it leaves us with one vital question. Is a temporary high really worth a permanent rewrite of who you are? It's a pretty sobering reality and a stark reminder to protect the most precious biological computer you'll ever own. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll catch you next time.